When Allied troops stormed Germany in 1945, hoping to arrest the Nazi leadership and bring them to justice, they had one major problem. The men were gone. Some had taken cyanide, others had vanished across borders. Many were never found at all. But their wives were still there. They opened the doors, smiled politely, held crying children, offered coffee, and told one story again and again. I knew nothing. I was just his wife. But the truth was far more sinister. These women weren't passive bystanders. They were proud of their husbands. Some joined the Nazi Party on their own. Others helped organize propaganda, raise racially pure children, and even enjoyed luxury stolen from concentration camp victims. They wrote love letters from prison cells, held Nazi family reunions in secret, and defended genocide long after the world called it what it was. Who were these women? Were they victims of power or willing architects of evil? This is not the story they told interrogators. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. Welcome to the untold lives of the Nazi wives, the women who loved monsters. Some of these women claimed they were dragged into history. Gerda Bormann? She ran toward it. Section 1. Gerda Bormann, the fanatical First Lady of Nazism. For many of the Nazi elite, politics was a stepping stone to power, luxury, and military prestige. But for Gerda Bormann, born Gerda Buch, Nazism was a religion, and Hitler wasn't a politician. He was something closer to a messiah. Gerda didn't just marry into the Nazi regime. She was the Nazi regime, long before the world even knew what horrors it would bring. Born in 1909 inches, the city of Konstanz, Gerda was raised in a household where Adolf Hitler was more than just a name in the newspaper. He was Uncle Adolf. Her father, Walter Buch, was a devout Nazi disciple from day one. He served as one of the party's early legal advisors and introduced his daughter to the rising movement not as something political, but as something pure, almost spiritual. Gerda soaked it all in. As a child, she idolized the men in brown uniforms and felt an overwhelming sense of purpose every time she heard Hitler speak. When the Third Reich began brewing in the shadows of Weimar Germany, she wasn't on the sidelines. She was already proudly aligned. And that's what made her different. Many women in the Nazi inner circle claimed to be apolitical. They said they were simply dutiful wives, swept up in turbulent history, never responsible, never involved. But Gerda, she joined the cult eyes wide open. And she did it long before her fateful introduction to a man named Martin Bormann. When Martin Bormann walked into her life, he wasn't yet the notorious figure history would remember. Stocky and thick-necked, with an appearance that screamed more factory foreman than political mastermind, Bormann was a second-tier Nazi at the time. He had only recently joined the party, and his reputation was far from impressive. But in the eyes of Gerda Buch, he wasn't just a man. He was a comrade, a romantic mirror of her own ideological devotion. They met through her father, naturally. Martin, fresh from a brief stint as a press officer and having transitioned into the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, the SA, ran into Walter Buch through party dealings. Sparks flew between Gerda and Martin quickly, not because of charm or charisma, but because of their deep, mutual worship of the movement. They spoke the same ideological language. They had the same dark, romantic vision for the future of Germany. In 1929, they married. Hitler himself sent well wishes. It was a union not just of love, but of absolute political commitment. As Hitler's rise to power accelerated, so did the Bormann's social standing. By 1933, when Hitler officially took the reins of Germany as chancellor, Martin Bormann climbed through the ranks like a storm, first becoming the chief of staff to Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, and soon after, the personal secretary to Hitler himself, one of the most powerful, yet shadowy, roles in Nazi Germany. Behind this growing giant of administration, Gerda was anything but passive. She fully embraced her husband's political duties and reveled in being part of the Führer's elite inner circle. Their household wasn't a simple home, it was a Nazi blueprint come to life. Together, they raised 9 children, a physical display of loyalty to the Führer's obsession with racial purity and population growth. Gerda took pride in being the model Aryan mother. She saw motherhood not just as a family duty, but as a national service. Her children weren't just kids, they were future soldiers and leaders of Hitler's vision. Meanwhile, the perks of power flowed in. Opulent estates, chauffeurs, private health care, lavish gifts. But wealth wasn't what Gerda celebrated. What brought her joy, what gave her a true sense of divine purpose, was being close to the center of Hitler's empire. But power always has a cost. By 1945, the world around them was falling violently apart. Soviet troops advanced from the east, Allied forces pushed in from the west, and the myth of the thousand-year Reich was collapsing into dust. Berlin was burning, and still, Gerda Bormann kept the faith. As reality closed in, the Bormann family executed an escape plan rooted in lies and misdirection. Gerda, now a mother of 9, dressed herself as the director of a children's home. 4 of her own children were disguised as orphans. The other 5 would remain with Martin, likely as a defensive move to split up the target, to reduce attention, or maybe, just maybe, to double the odds that some would survive. They fled through the war-torn soil of southern Germany, aiming for refuge near the Italian-Austrian border. There, nestled in a quiet valley 30 miles from Bolzano, a high-ranking Nazi official arranged their sanctuary. Secret documents, family papers, removed SS emblems, all locked away in safe homes while the Bormann legacy went underground. But every lie came with a cost. And as they fled deeper into hiding, Gerda's body began to fail her. Her sister-in-law, traveling beside her, noticed first. The normally stoic Gerda began to wince in pain. Whispered complaints turned into groaned sentences. Doctors weren't easy to find, but when one finally examined her, the news was brutal. Advanced ovarian cancer. With war chaos still erupting, and American and British forces now controlling the region, Gerda's fate rushed toward her. She was fading and fast. Her condition secret, her identity barely veiled. She was now being pursued not just by death, but by Allied intelligence officers. British soldiers found her in early 1946, after local intelligence tipped them off. A British Army major knocked on her safe house door. When she saw the uniform, panic overtook her. She thought she was being sent to a concentration camp. Instead, the officer offered her something unexpected: hospital care. Gerda was taken to a POW medical facility in nearby Murano. She underwent surgery, but the cancer had spread too far. The operation failed. There would be no recovery. Facing death, Gerda didn't cling to her Nazi ideals. Instead, she turned to something older, something she had once mocked: Catholicism. In those final weeks, she converted. Some believe it was an act of desperation. Others say it was genuine repentance. Still, others argue it was political, a last-ditch attempt to secure safety for her children. Whatever the case, on March 23, 1946, Gerda Bormann died. She was just 36 years old and had spent over half her life embedded in one of the most evil regimes in modern history. Her husband, Martin Bormann, had already taken his own life almost a year earlier, chewing down a cyanide capsule as Russian troops swarmed Berlin. His body wouldn't be discovered until decades later, a skeleton found near a railway bridge, finally confirmed by DNA. Until then, rumors swirled. Some claimed he escaped. Others insisted he was still running an underground Nazi network. His death, like Gerda's, became part of the Reich's ghost stories. But Gerda's story cuts deeper. She wasn't a mistress or a trophy wife. She wasn't a woman who married into darkness without seeing the signs. She was there from the beginning, a true believer, a mother, a manipulator, a master of disguise, a woman who raised 9 children while wrapped in the ideology of death and supremacy. To the world, she played the part of a matron. But behind the curtains, she was something far more dangerous, a true Nazi princess who helped build the foundations of evil, then tried to quietly vanish into myth. But while Gerda disguised herself to escape justice, the next Nazi wife didn't even try. Instead, she made a final, horrifying choice and took her children with her. Section 2. Magda Goebbels, the mother who poisoned her own children. When Berlin finally began to collapse under Soviet fire in the spring of 1945, no one expected Magda Goebbels to survive, but no one imagined how she would choose to die. While Gerda Bormann fled with her 9 children in disguise, Magda Goebbels made a quieter, more horrifying decision. She would end her life, but only after ending the lives of her 6 innocent children. In Hitler's bunker, as the world burned above them, Magda wrote her final legacy, not in ink, but in the blood of her family. To understand how someone could make that decision, you have to begin at the start, before the bunker, before the war, before the name Goebbels became synonymous with sadistic propaganda. Born Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl in 1901, Magda had a cosmopolitan childhood. She grew up in Brussels, spoke multiple languages, and eventually married a wealthy German industrialist named Günther Quandt. He was nearly twice her age, cold and conservative, but she enjoyed the luxuries of elite German society. When the marriage ended in 1929 after Quandt discovered her affair, Magda received a generous settlement, money, property, and a fashionable apartment in Berlin. Free and rich in a rapidly shifting Germany, Magda didn't waste time with self-reflection. She was drawn to the noise, the marches, the spectacle, and very quickly, the man orchestrating it all, Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was not a natural romantic catch. He was a small, intense man with a clubfoot, a pronounced limp, and a dark pout. But his power over a crowd and over people's minds was unmatched. As Hitler's chief propagandist, he stirred emotions like a conductor with a symphony of rage, hope, and fanaticism. Magda saw past his physical flaws. In him, she recognized someone who could shape destiny. He saw in her a rare blend of beauty, social class, and political loyalty. Their affair ignited in 1931. By December, Magda, already pregnant, married Joseph Goebbels in a civil and church ceremony. Adolf Hitler served as his best man. When Magda thanked the Führer with a kiss on the cheek, witnesses later said Hitler's eyes filled with tears. That kiss was more than symbolic. From the start, Magda was rumored to be more than just close to Hitler. Their emotional bond was intense, borderline romantic. Goebbels hated it, but he couldn't compete. Some historians argue that Magda didn't marry Joseph for love at all. She wanted permanent access to Hitler. Magda embraced her place in the Nazi elite with precision. She styled herself as the first mother of the Reich, not just as Joseph's wife, but as a national example. In total, she had 6 children: Helga, Hilda, Helmuth, Hold, Hedda, and Heidi, all Aryan, perfect blonde, haired, blue-eyed, and disturbingly photogenic. During the Nazi golden years, the Goebbels family was propaganda fodder. Newspapers and magazines featured smiling photos of the beautiful family purity and human form. Behind closed doors, however, things were far from wholesome. Joseph Goebbels was a prolific adulterer. He openly cheated and sometimes flaunted his affairs, most famously with the Czech actress Lida Barova. Magda was devastated, not only by his infidelity, but by the hypocrisy. She had once been told divorce from a top Nazi official wasn't an option. Hitler personally intervened during some of the couple's worst arguments, mediating like the father of a dysfunctional household. He insisted they remain married even if they hated each other. So they did. Through World War II, while Joseph flooded Germany with anti-Semitic lies, Magda played hostess to diplomats and military leaders, appearing in public as the ideal German woman, soft-spoken, patriotic, and loyal to the end. What she didn't show was how much she physically suffered. Multiple pregnancies and a congenital heart condition left her weak. At times, she could barely walk. Still, she pressed on. She trained as a Red Cross nurse, but her heart made it difficult to fulfill duties. Servants reported that she frequently wept alone, depressed, exhausted, but obsessively protective of her children. By April 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Allied bombs lit up Berlin. Soviet artillery was 2 streets away. Hitler had locked himself in the Führer bunker under the Chancellery, and the Nazi top brass followed. Magda and Joseph took their children down the stairway into the cement-lined tomb. It was supposed to be temporary, but Magda already knew it would be her family's grave. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide less than 48 hours after marrying. That same afternoon, Magda and Joseph walked down the narrow halls of the bunker to say goodbye. Eyewitnesses said they didn't cry. They didn't scream. They seemed resolved. Before returning to their quarters, they joined Hitler's remaining staff for what people would later call the Last Supper of the Third Reich. Magda's 6 children slept nearby. They had no idea what was coming. On May 1st, 1945, sometime in the afternoon, a man named Helmut Kunz, a dentist and SS captain, was summoned to the bunker's family quarter. At Magda Goebbels' request, and with her full knowledge, he administered morphine injections to the children one by one. The children's names were called. None of them protested. Most believed they were told it was medicine. Once all 6 were unconscious, Cyanide capsules were crushed in their mouths. Their bodies were arranged peacefully like they were sleeping. Helga, the eldest at 12 years old, might have resisted. Her face, according to one source, had visible bruising. She may have realized the truth and fought back, but there are no reliable witnesses to confirm whether that account is true. What is certain is that within an hour, all 6 children were dead. Their faces were serene. Their deaths were cold. And Magda had insisted on every step of it. She once told a friend, "I belong to my husband. Together with our children, we belong to the Führer." To Magda, a world without Hitler, a post-Nazi world, was not a world worth living in. She also feared that her children would be taken in by Allied forces and raised in a society that would mock and shame their father's name. That thought, she said, was unbearable. And so, she took their futures into her own hands. After murdering her children, she and Joseph ascended the stairs into the ruined garden of the Chancellery. There they each bit down on cyanide. Joseph also fired a bullet through his own skull. Just to be sure, an SS bodyguard shot their corpses again and covered them in gasoline. Their charred remains were found the next morning by Soviet troops. Magda Goebbels, once a glamorous socialite, became the face of fanatical loyalty not just to Hitler, but to an ideology that demanded total sacrifice. She chose not just to die, she chose to be one of the last believers. And in doing so, she committed one of the most monstrous acts of a mother in modern history, ending the lives of her own children for an idea she still refused to let go. Today, there is no grave, no headstone, nothing to mark the lives of the 6 children whose only crime was being born in the house of Joseph and Magda Goebbels. They became victims of a legacy they never asked to be a part of, and symbols of how deep blind obedience and ideological violence can run. But while Magda died with her husband and children, others survived the war and chose to carry the torch of Nazism into the next century. One of them was Ilse Hess, a woman who turned her husband's betrayal into a lifelong mission for redemption and revisionism. Section 3. Ilse Hess, the loyal pen pal of a Nazi martyr. When Rudolf Hess boarded a German military plane in 1941 and took off alone for Scotland, the entire Nazi hierarchy was left speechless. Hitler was furious. Goebbels called it madness. Himmler thought it was a British setup, and no one, not even his closest advisors, knew the full story. But far away from Berlin, in a quiet home in Munich, one person wasn't shocked at all. Ilse Hess had seen it coming, because ever since the early 1922, she had watched and supported every political obsession, every odd behavior, every wild move her husband made. In fact, she often encouraged it. And when he vanished into foreign skies in an unauthorized mission that would make headlines around the world, Ilse didn't collapse. She opened a notebook and started writing. Before she became Ilse Hess, she was Ilse Prohl, a bright, upper-class young woman with a passion for books, poetry, and classical German culture. Unlike many of the Nazi wives who were drawn to the movement through marriage, Ilse was already a believer long before she became a wife. She met Rudolf Hess in Munich sometime in the early 1922. He wasn't famous then, not even close. What he was intense. Haunted eyes, a gaunt face, silences that stretched too long. A decorated war veteran wounded twice in World War I. Hess had a presence that was difficult to describe, somewhere between ghost and martyr. Ilse found herself drawn to him, not physically at first, but spiritually. Their relationship was one of ideas, German romanticism, national revival, the pain of defeat, and the rage that followed the Treaty of Versailles. Their bond never revolved around passion. It wasn't sexual. In fact, Hess showed little to no interest in physical intimacy. Ilse was often quietly frustrated by it. But to her, he offered something rare. A partner who valued her intellectual and ideological fire. They read together, wrote together, worshipped the same twisted gods of nationalism and anti-Semitism. They weren't just lovers. They were comrades in extremism. By the mid-1922s, Hitler's movement was gaining traction, and Hess was one of his earliest and most fanatical supporters. During the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, Hess stood beside Hitler as gunfire tore through the streets of Munich. Afterward, Hess fled, then returned, only to be arrested and thrown into prison with Hitler and other conspirators. The prison they were sent to? Landsberg. While imprisoned, Hitler dictated the early chapters of Mein Kampf, and Rudolf Hess served as one of his primary editors and copyists. Ilse, meanwhile, visited with unwavering loyalty. Every Saturday, like clockwork, she stood by the prison gates for her allotted visitation time. There were no weekends off, no hesitation. Her love for Hess was unshakable, and it was returned. When he was released from prison, their marriage was almost immediate. In 1927, Ilse Braun became Ilse Hess. 10 years later, she gave birth to their only child, Wolf Rudiger Hess, a name that carried every ounce of Germanic myth and Nazi symbolism. As Hess climbed the ranks and eventually became Hitler's deputy Führer, Ilse slipped into the role of political housewife, silent in public, active in private. But make no mistake, she was not naive. Ilse Hess believed fully in the Nazi cause. Her marriage wasn't a privilege, it was her duty. She worked behind the scenes for the party, helped publish ideological texts, and wrote articles lauding the new Germany under Hitler. To her, National Socialism wasn't a fashionable movement or a ticket to luxury, it was a sacred calling. Even when it became clear that Hess was increasingly unstable, paranoid, isolated, and emotionally erratic, Ilse never backed away. His distance only seemed to deepen her loyalty. She knew that Rudolf was growing restless. He believed that the war was a mistake, at least in the way Hitler was handling it. And in secret, Rudolf had begun working on a private plan, one that Ilse privately supported. A plan to fly, alone, across the English Channel. In May 1941, he did just that. In one of the most bizarre moments of World War II, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess took off in a lone Messerschmitt Bf 110 and crash-landed in Scotland, hoping to meet members of the British government and offer a separate peace treaty. The British were stunned. They arrested him immediately. Hitler was livid, calling Hess mentally ill. The Nazi leadership disowned and humiliated him. But Ilse? She called him a hero. To her, his peace mission was a noble effort to end the war before Germany was destroyed. In her eyes, he had sacrificed everything to save the fatherland. And just like in the old days when she stood at the gates of a Bavarian prison, she picked up her pen and began writing. For the remaining 44 years of Rudolf Hess's life, Ilse served as his personal link to the outside world. Even after the Nuremberg trial sentenced him to life imprisonment in the infamous Spandau prison, Ilse never missed a beat. She was interrogated after the war, arrested, detained in internment camps, carefully questioned about how much she had known. Like the other wives, she claimed innocence, insisting that politics had always been her husband's territory. But unlike others, Ilse never really tried to separate herself from his actions. In public and private, she maintained he hadn't betrayed Hitler. He had saved Germany. After her release in March 1948, with much of her social circle gone or disgraced, Ilse retreated into the Bavarian Alps. There, she opened a small guest house in a quiet town. But her real work was behind closed doors, a tireless campaign to preserve her husband's legacy. She wrote dozens of letters to officials, friends, and publishers. She started cataloging correspondence, preparing what would become a romanticized self-narrative of Rudolf's sacrifice. In 1952, she released her first book. In 1954, another followed, Rudolf Hess, Prisoner of Peace, a deliberate rebranding of a top Nazi official as a misunderstood visionary. The book became a rallying point for Nazi sympathizers and revisionists worldwide. Ilse wasn't just writing to remember him, she was writing to revive him. She launched petitions to have him released from prison. She petitioned at the United Nations. She wrote editorials. All the while, she raised their son with the same beliefs Rudolf had held dear. Rudolf Hess died in prison in 1987. Officially, he took his own life, a final act of despair after decades of confinement. But Ilse didn't buy the story. To her last breath, she claimed he was murdered, that the Western powers had silenced him before he could fully explain the truth. Ironically, or perhaps inevitably, it was Ilse who would write the last chapters of his life. Ilse Hess died in 1995 at the age of 95. She had lived through both world wars, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, international tribunals, the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and yet nothing altered her loyalty. She never renounced Hitler, never abandoned her husband, never admitted remorse. In many ways, her story is more dangerous than those who died in the war. Because Ilse Hess survived it, and used her years, her words, and her legacy to quietly repackage evil as devotion. She recast the man who stood beside Hitler, who signed off on racist laws, who supported early concentration camps as a romantic hero, a misunderstood statesman, a martyr for peace, all through the letters, all through the books, all through the unwavering pen of a woman who never once asked, "What if we were wrong?" But Ilse Hess wasn't the only one who played innocent. Coming up next, Margaret Himmler, wife of the architect of the Holocaust. She claims she knew nothing, but the evidence speaks volumes. Section 4. Margaret Himmler, the silent collaborator. When Allied soldiers began rounding up the last remaining family members of Nazi high command, a strange pattern emerged. Most of the wives told the exact same story. "I was only a housewife. I had no idea what my husband was really doing. I never asked question." Their testimonies blurred together like rehearsed lines from the same smudged script, but none embody this chilling aura of polite ignorance better than Margaret Himmler, the wife of one of the most infamous mass murderers in history, and a woman whose silence continues to haunt historians to this day. She did not write memoirs. She did not speak to the press. She vanished into obscurity, quietly, deliberately, almost like she knew she had something to hide. But peel back the layers, and you'll find the calculated story of a woman who stood far closer to evil than she ever admitted. A chance meeting with murder. Margaret Boden came from what many would call a respectable, traditional German family. Born in 1893, she was older than many of the other Nazi wives. A generation earlier, she might have lived and died as a middle-class nurse in some sleepy Bavarian town. But in 1927, her life veered off course. During a long, uneventful train ride from Munich to Berlin, she struck up a conversation with a man she had never seen before. He spoke politely, with a certain nervous energy, and carried himself with ambition, even though he clearly came from modest means. His name? Heinrich Himmler. For most of the world, that name is now synonymous with industrialized genocide. As head of the SS, orchestrator of the final solution, and creator of the Nazi police state, Himmler was one of Hitler's most trusted lieutenants and perhaps the man most responsible for operationalizing the Holocaust. But in 1927, he was just another party functionary, quiet, obsessed with discipline, order, and oddly romantic about farming and folklore. Their casual train conversation turned into something more. The two began exchanging letters and wouldn't stop for years. Love through letters. The early years of their relationship were mostly spent apart. Margaret, already working as a trained Red Cross nurse, lived in different parts of Germany. Himmler was bouncing around with the still developing Nazi party, often broke, often restless. But what sustained them wasn't chemistry. It was purpose. That purpose wasn't family. It wasn't romance. It was something bigger. What bonded them was ideology. Both shared a commitment to traditional German values. Both admired the concepts of national purity, rural peasantry, and moral strength. And though Margaret never made fiery speeches or stood on a podium, she deeply sympathized with the emerging Nazi worldview even before the party took power. In the letters they exchanged, she often praised Hitler and expressed hope that the party would rise. When they finally married, it wasn't the kind of passionate love story that filled propaganda magazines. But it didn't need to be. They were partners in ideology, and now, officially in life. The life of a shadow queen. By the time Hitler seized power in 1933, Himmler was placed in charge of the SS. Over the next decade, he would create concentration camps, train the Gestapo, oversee racial policies, and rise to one of the highest and deadliest positions in the Nazi state. And Margaret? She played the perfect role of the distant yet supportive wife. But what did she really know? That question has haunted post-war investigations for decades. As Himmler grew more powerful, Margaret deliberately faded into the background. She stayed away from Berlin and politics. She lived primarily in the family estate in Gmund by the Tegernsee Lake and raised their only daughter, Gudrun. But distance doesn't mean innocence. Numerous letters, testimonies, and personal archives reveal she wasn't just a passive outsider. She managed the SS household budgets, reviewed staff and servants, and maintained close friendships with elite Nazi women. She was not merely in the orbit of power, she was steering a part of it. Reports suggest she not only supported her husband's racial ideals, but became his sounding board. She wrote regularly to SS wives, often including ideological messages in her letters. She advocated for racial awareness among German women, promoted the Aryan motherhood ideal, and ensured that the integrity of Nazi values was maintained inside and outside the home. To outsiders, she was just Frau Himmler, a woman who stayed out of politics and minded her daughter. But inside Nazi Germany, she was a symbol, a mother of the Reich, a quiet collaborator. The storm breaks. In the final months of the war, Himmler made the shocking decision to try and negotiate peace with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. It was a desperate, treasonous act, and Hitler found out. Himmler was expelled from the Nazi Party. His empire collapsed overnight. When the Allies took Berlin, Margaret Himmler disappeared. She had packed up and fled, along with her daughter Gudrun, intending to reach South Tyrol and vanish among friendly territory. But the Americans found them first. In May 1945, near the Italian town of Bolzano, Margaret and Gudrun were captured by U.S. forces. They were interrogated immediately under suspicion of holding Nazi secrets or helping officials flee. And that's when the mask began to slip. During a routine search, a vial of potassium cyanide was found sewn into the lining of Margaret's coat, the same kind of capsule that Himmler and other high-ranking Nazis used to commit suicide. She claimed it wasn't hers. Another lie, calmly delivered. Prison, interrogation, and denial. Margaret spent the next year bouncing through a series of internment centers across Italy, France, and Germany. Under questioning, she stuck to her story. She didn't know anything about her husband's operations. She never asked questions. She was simply raising their daughter. Except, witnesses began coming forward. Servants, staff, SS wives, even intercepted letters. They told a different story. Margaret had known plenty. She discussed her husband's work freely at social events. She expressed open anti-Semitism. Some reports even suggested she had connections to looted property taken from Jewish victims deported to the camps. Still, no formal charges were brought for war crimes. In 1948, after 3 trials and a series of appeals, a West German judge issued a final ruling. Marguerite would not be imprisoned, but she would be officially classified as a Nazi beneficiary. She lost her pension. She lost the right to vote. She would be required to perform menial labor as punishment. It was, in the eyes of many survivors and historians, a gross injustice. Because Margaret Himmler had lived beside genocide and did nothing. Because she had watched her husband build a machine of death and said nothing. Because she had believed in the ideals of Nazi Germany and changed nothing, disappearing into darkness. After her release, Margaret withdrew completely from public life. She moved in with her sister Lydia in the village of Hepen. There would be no memoirs, no interviews, no reckoning. She lived quietly, stubbornly maintaining that she didn't know what Heinrich had done. To the very end, she wore the crown of ignorance like armor. She never reconnected with Gudrun's half-siblings. She never expressed public remorse. And when she died on the 25th of August 1967, at the age of 74, there was no national debate, no headlines, just a small private burial. A quiet end for a woman who had lived so close to evil and never once tried to distance herself. Today, Margaret's story remains one of the most haunting examples of soft complicity. She didn't lead troops. She didn't run camps. She didn't design gas chambers. But with every silent dinner, every looked-away atrocity, every polite nod in the face of horror, she helped normalize the impossible. But while Margaret kept quiet, another woman, Hedwig Höss, embraced her position. She wasn't just Himmler's mistress. She lived in a house filled with human remains. Section 5. Hedwig Höss, the mistress and collector of nightmares. If Margaret Himmler was the model of restraint and denial, Hedwig Höss was her total opposite. She wasn't a loyal wife quietly looking the other way. She wasn't hiding in family estates or pleading ignorance. She was the mistress of Heinrich Himmler, and she didn't just know what was going on according to some accounts. She showed it off proudly. Hedwig Höss wasn't evil by accident. She was one of the rare Nazi women who lived and possibly delighted in the bizarre, privileged madness of the Third Reich's inner circle. And her taste in home decor? It wasn't just disturbing. It was inhuman. From post office clerk to SS elite. Hedwig was born in 1912 to middle-class parents, raised in a traditional German family with steady values and strict routines. She was bright, bubbly, and well-liked by friends. In school, she excelled at languages and went on to study at the Institute for Interpreters in Mannheim. She seemed destined for a quiet life. Her first job was harmless enough, a clerk at the local post office. But Hedwig wanted more. In 1935, she applied for work in the Gestapo's press department. It was one of the few agencies within Hitler's growing regime that allowed upward mobility for educated women. She studied English, smiled easily, and worked hard, but ambition ran deeper than paperwork. Soon after joining, in January 1936, she was promoted to become the personal secretary of SS leader Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful names in Nazi Germany. From then on, her life and history would never be the same. Bunny and the Butcher. To her friends, Hedwig was cheerful, fun, energetic. They called her Bunny. She loved gymnastics, rowing, and attending SS staff parties. Her youth and warm personality stood in sharp contrast with the cold, clinical man she now worked beside daily. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, mastermind of the SS. Himmler was obsessed with health, race, spiritualism, and control. He was also married with a daughter and lived a life carefully crafted for Nazi propaganda. But in private, he fell for Hedwig. By the end of 1938, the two began a romantic affair. Within a few years, Hedwig had become his hidden second family. They had 2 children together, a boy and a girl raised in secret outside Berlin, far from the public eye. Margaret, Himmler's wife, eventually found out. In a rare moment of defiance, she was furious. But divorce was not an option. Hitler himself prohibited it. Instead, the triangle remained frozen, 1 wife in public, 1 mistress in private, and miles of corpses between them ignored. A house filled with horror. By 1941, Hedwig had officially resigned from the SS, at least on paper, but her lifestyle and influence remained very much intact. Himmler arranged for her to live in a spacious home deep in the forest of Mecklenburg, isolated from scrutiny but close enough to the Nazi elite to remain a part of their world. Later, he upgraded her again, a quiet cottage near Berghof, just a short drive from Hitler's Eagle's Nest retreat. It was this house that would become infamous. According to later testimonies, especially from Gerda Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, Hedwig once invited several women and children upstairs during a visit. What she showed them was more than just chilling. It was grotesque. The attic no one forgot. Gerda recalled the moment in horrifying detail. The attic of Hedwig's home was decorated with furniture made from human body parts. Not replicas, not antiques. The real thing. A chair made from a human pelvis, with legs crafted from full human tibia bones, ending in actual human feet mounted like furniture legs. Other items included bindings of Mein Kampf made from human skin, specifically the back flesh of prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp. These artifacts were not hidden in shame or secrecy. Hedwig reportedly described the process proudly. She explained how the skin was removed, how the chair was assembled, almost as though giving a house tour. Even by Nazi standards, this was too much. Martin Bormann allegedly refused a similar skin-bound book from Himmler, saying it made him physically sick, and Gerda Bormann, after seeing Hedwig's collection, quickly left and never returned, disappearing into the shadows. After the war, Hedwig Potthast vanished from public view almost instantly. She retreated to Bavaria and lived with an old friend named Eleanor Poel. But the U.S. Army quickly caught up with her. She was arrested, interrogated for days in Munich, and questioned about the contents of her home, her connection to Himmler, and what she knew about the camps. She denied everything. No knowledge of torture, no involvement in crimes, no relationship with what Himmler had done. There were no photographs of the attic, no forensic documents, and no surviving physical evidence. And so, she walked, never officially tried, never convicted, never forced to testify at Nuremberg. A life of silence. After her release, Hedwig remarried and disappeared into civilian life. When Himmler's daughter, Gudrun, learned about her and about her secret half-siblings, she tried to connect. She reached out multiple times, hoping to meet the family she never knew she had. Hedwig refused. She never spoke publicly again, not once about Himmler, their children, or the crimes he helped orchestrate. In fact, almost nothing is known about the final decades of her life. She lived quietly, changed her name, and avoided journalists, historians, truth commissions, even neighbors. On September 22, 1994, She died at the age of 82 inches Bonn-Bad Godesberg, West Germany. No biography, no trials, no apologies, just 6 decades of silence, and the haunting possibility that, in a hidden attic once upon a time, the full madness of the Nazi regime took a macabre, physical form shaped by one woman's hands. But while some Nazi women faded into hiding, others emerged as icons of a dangerous movement that refused to die. Coming up next, Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of monsters who became their biggest defender. Section 6. Gudrun Himmler, the angel-faced neo-Nazi. The daughter of a killer, Gudrun was born in 1929, the only child of Heinrich Himmler, the man who designed and executed the Holocaust, and Margaret Himmler, who played the role of the perfect nationalist wife. As Reichsfuhrer of the SS, Himmler saw his daughter not merely as family but as a symbol of all he wanted to protect. He called her his golden girl, and she accompanied him on official visits, even to places that children should never have seen. In one of the most chilling reports, one 2-year-old Gudrun was spotted visiting the Dachau concentration camp, where thousands were tortured and murdered. After that visit, she reportedly wrote in her diary, "We saw everything. It was very interesting." Whether she truly understood what she was seeing is unclear. What is certain is this: Gudrun was raised in the heart of Nazi horror and told every day that it was righteous, noble, and good. War, collapse, and the fall of the Himmlers. As the war ground to its bloody end in 1945, the Himmler family scrambled to disappear. Like many top officials, they knew what was coming: trials, prison, possibly execution. Margaret and Gudrun fled south, trying to disappear across the Austrian border. They made it as far as South Tyrol, where American forces captured them at a small hotel near Bolzano. Gudrun was just 16 years old, but even at that age, there were signs the ideology had sunk in deep. After their capture, American soldiers found a cyanide capsule sewn into the shoulder padding of Marguerite's coat. As her mother was interrogated and shuttled between internment sites, Gudrun remained calm, polite, and distant. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. And when she was finally interrogated on the 22nd of September 1945, Gudrun claimed she didn't know much of anything. She had spent the last 5 years, she said, at school or at home. When asked about her visit to Dachau, she spoke of it like a school trip, nothing more. When asked if her parents discussed their work or any post-war plans, she answered simply, "They never told me anything." The interrogators believed her. After all, she was just a child. But they couldn't see the future. They couldn't see what that child would grow up to become: the widow of a regime. After their release in 1946, Margaret and Gudrun lived in hiding with religious shelter groups across Germany. They were no longer Himmlers in public. They were refugees behind closed doors. In the eyes of the new Germany, they were irrelevant, forgotten. But Gudrun hadn't forgotten anything. When she learned of her father's death, that Heinrich had bitten a cyanide capsule shortly after capture, Gudrun didn't mourn like a victim's daughter. She mourned like a loyal soldier. She refused to believe he had taken his own life. For years, she insisted he had been murdered by British intelligence to silence secrets he never got to share. This wasn't just denial. This was the birth of a mission: becoming the princess of the SS. In post-war Germany, while the world tried to erase Nazi ideology from every street name and building, a new movement started to grow underground, a shadow network of former SS officers, Nazi sympathizers, and ultranationalist youth. And Gudrun became their queen. Through secret meetings, handwritten letters, and well-protected circles, she began organizing. She joined Still Hilfe, Silent Help, a supposedly humanitarian organization that worked behind the scenes to support ex-SS men, convicted war criminals, and their families. What started as charitable aid quickly became something more dangerous: a financial and political lifeline for neo-Nazism throughout Europe. Together with fellow sympathizers, Gudrun raised money for legal battles, bought off lawyers and judges, and assisted in the escape efforts of war criminals, including those hiding as far away as South America. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was the backbone, the Viking youth, and secret intelligence. In the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds, Gudrun co-founded a small but fierce organization called the Viking Youth. Modeled after the Hitler Youth, it offered outdoor training, racial ideology, and militaristic discipline to post-war German teenagers who still yearned for what the Reich had promised. This wasn't a game. It was indoctrination. Meanwhile, the West German government, under pressure from Allied forces and desperate to rebuild, was also becoming more forgiving. And in a stunning twist, Gudrun Himmler was hired by West Germany's Bureau of Intelligence, BND, in the early 1960 seconds under a fake name. The irony was jaw-dropping. The daughter of the SS leader was now part of the very system that claimed to purge Germany of its fascist past. But many intelligence officials during that time were former Nazis themselves, hired in the anti-communist frenzy to help fight the new Cold War enemy. Gudrun fit right in, defender of monsters. For decades, Gudrun stayed active in the underworld of German extremism but kept her public profile low. Then, in 1958, she made a rare appearance as the guest of honor at a gathering of SS veterans and Nazi sympathizers in Austria. The event was held at a sacred forest site once used by Celtic tribes, intentionally steeped in nationalist and racial mysticism. There, old SS officers referred to Gudrun as "our princess," not sarcastically, but with genuine reverence. She was now a living link to the old world, and her life mission was crystal clear: to restore the honor of the SS, to erase the shame of her father, and to carry the flame of Nazi ideology into the next generation. She succeeded. A legacy of loyalty. Through the 1990 seconds and 2000s, while the rest of the world aged into the age of the internet and post-racial discourse, Gudrun never changed. She continued to attend SS funerals. She ran clandestine support networks funded by donations from all over Europe. She made pilgrimages to grave sites of Nazis and helped keep their memories alive in nationalist youth groups. And through it all, she maintained the same public line: "My father was a good man. He loved Germany. He did what he had to do. No regrets. No apologies. No break from the past." Death of a true believer. Gudrun Himmler died in 2018 at the age of 88. Official obituaries described her as a quietly controversial figure, which was more than a little generous. In reality, she was one of the last living defenders of the darkest regime in modern history. Until her final days, Gudrun lived off pensions, donations, and quiet admiration from the furthest corners of the German far right. Her home was filled with SS memorabilia, and correspondence reveals she still kept photos of her father in full uniform above her desk. She never renounced anything. In fact, she believed that denazification had been a mistake and that Europe had lost something important when her father's vision died. And the terrifying part? She wasn't alone. Her followers, her groups, her influence still linger in underground forums, radical networks, and historical revisionist circles across Germany and beyond. Because the truth is, Gudrun Himmler didn't just inherit her father's name. She inherited his mission. But what happens when the horrors aren't just talked about but literally next door? Up next, Hedwig Höss, the wife who lived a quiet, privileged life, while Auschwitz operated on the other side of her garden fence. Section 7. Hedwig Höss, the housewife next to hell. They called it the zone of interest, a polite bureaucratic label for a space that was anything but neutral. This zone was the perimeter around Auschwitz, the largest and deadliest Nazi concentration camp. Inside its fences, over 1 million people were murdered, reduced to smoke, bones, and ash. But just outside those fences, another world existed. Trees, a garden, a large villa, a swing set beneath the window. And inside that villa, a woman named Hedwig Höss. She drank tea by the window, raised her 5 children, hosted guests, complained about her servants, and bathed in a tub a few hundred meters from the gas chambers. Auschwitz was hell, but Hedwig Höss, she called it home. The wife of Auschwitz, Hedwig Hensel, later known as Hedwig Höss, was born in 1908 Nordhausen in central Germany. Not much is known about her early life, perhaps because it was uneventful. She was quiet, reserved, and came from a traditional family. At 21, she met Rudolf Höss, a rising officer in the Nazi ranks, and her life changed forever. Rudolf was not charming. He wasn't charismatic or handsome. He was cold, methodical, and intensely loyal to the Nazi cause. But what he offered was something else: power, structure, and ideology. They married quickly and wasted no time starting a family. Together, they had 5 children: Klaus, Annegret, Heidroth, Ingeborg, and Hans. Rudolf. Hedwig settled into domestic life with efficiency and pride. She didn't dream of fame or fashion. She dreamed of order, of cleanliness, of a home built on values. In this sense, the Nazi worldview fit perfectly with her own. And when her husband was appointed commandant of Auschwitz in 1940, Hedwig didn't hesitate. She packed up the children and moved them into a dream villa just outside the most horrifying place on earth. The house over the fence. The house was close, too close. From the garden, it was said the smoke from the crematoriums was often visible. The wind carried strange smells. Sometimes, screams could be heard when the wind shifted just right. But when survivors were later asked, when officials and historians tried to figure out what Hedwig could have possibly known, a haunting question emerged. How much did she choose not to see? The perfect German housewife. Inside the villa, Hedwig created a curated world. Fresh curtains, polished wood floors, flowers on the table, family portraits on the walls. She had the best kitchen appliances. SS staff catered to her whims. Her children wore the finest uniforms. To outsiders, she was the ideal Nazi wife. Supportive, silent, stylish, fertile. While her husband oversaw the death of thousands per day, she tended roses, baked black forest cake, and managed her staff with military precision. Former servants later spoke about her obsession with cleanliness, her fierce temper if things were out of place, and how quickly she adjusted to life at Auschwitz. She reportedly bragged about finally getting the type of home she had always dreamed of. And the irony? It came at the expense of the people being slaughtered just down the road. Whispers in the garden. For decades, defenders of women like Hedwig claimed ignorance. How could she have known? She was just a housewife. She didn't go to the camp. She didn't run the war. But survivors told a different story. Multiple accounts describe Hedwig riding on horseback near the fence line, visible to the prisoners. Some said she accepted gifts, furs, and jewels taken from luggage collected at the ramps, where people were told they were going to work, only to be led to their deaths. She never asked how those items had been acquired. Or perhaps she never needed to. Survival through denial. When the Nazi regime began crumbling in 1945, Rudolf Höss knew that his fate was sealed. He arranged to disappear, cutting contact with his family and attempting to hide under a false identity. Hedwig, meanwhile, made a decision. She stayed. Rather than flee, she calculated that abandoning her home, her children, and her supposed innocence would be risky. It looked worse. It implied guilt. If she did nothing, if she kept her head down, perhaps she could disappear into the chaos and pretend this life had never happened. But the Allies found her. She was captured and interrogated by British troops. Officials questioned her about her life at Auschwitz, the gifts, the proximity. Calmly and clearly, she insisted she had known nothing about what went on there. It was all her husband's business. She said she had been occupied raising children and maintaining the home. She had never visited the camp, never been told anything, never asked. Her demeanor, they reported, was eerily calm, as if she had prepared her lines years in advance. A parade of trial avoidance. Rudolf Höss was eventually found, tried, and sentenced to death. His execution took place at the very same camp he once commanded Auschwitz. But Hedwig? She was never charged. Despite living on site, despite evidence of indirect involvement, despite survivor accounts, there wasn't enough hard proof to convict her. She moved between homes in Germany for years. Eventually, she resettled in Arlington, Virginia, in the United States, where one of her daughters, Ingeborg, had started a new life as a fashion model. And in the fall of 1989, Hedwig Höss quietly died. No court, no apology, no acknowledgement. She was buried under a simple grave marker that read only one German word: Mutti, Mommy. Legacy of the unspoken. The story of Hedwig Höss is less about what she did and more about what she allowed. She did not build gas chambers. She did not sign orders. She did not load families into cattle cars. But she lived in a house built by stolen lives. She wore jewelry taken from the murdered. She ate meals prepared by SS servants while smoke rose outside her window. And when asked about it, she said this: nothing. It's often said, that greater horrors are done not just by loud monsters, but by the quiet ones. Those who smile, set the table, tuck in children, and pretend not to hear the screams. Hedwig Höss represents millions of people not just in Nazi Germany, but in every system of violence who convince themselves that silence is innocence. But silence is often a choice, a lie told in the voice of comfort, a lullaby at the edge of a mass grave. But while Hedwig Höss hid behind silence, others championed hate out loud. Next up, Lena Heydrich, one of the most fanatical believers in Hitler's vision and the woman who helped build a war criminal's legacy in blood. Section 8. Lena Heydrich, Hitler's devoted follower. Before Reinhard Heydrich became one of the most feared names in Nazi Germany, the architect of the final solution, commander of the Reich main security office, and one of the SS's most brutal minds, he was simply a naval officer with no future. But then he met Lena von Osten, and everything changed. Lena wasn't just another bystander. She wasn't someone who didn't know. She was a true believer. Born into a wealthy German family in 1911, Lena had grown up disillusioned by the chaos of post-World War I Germany. By her teens, she was already drawn to Hitler's speeches, eager for structure, power, and purity. Her older brother was among the early Nazi Party followers and often took her to rallies. Lena adored it all. In 1930, she attended a dull naval ball where she met a tall, fair-haired officer with cold blue eyes and an awkward smile. His name was Reinhard Heydrich. His career at that point was in ruins. He'd been kicked out of the Navy for conduct unbecoming after a broken engagement. Lena didn't mind. She urged him to join the SS, telling him the Nazi Party was where true futures were made. She didn't rescue Heydrich. She weaponized him. Through her influence, Heydrich met Heinrich Himmler, who hired him to build the SS's intelligence service from the ground up. Lena married him in 1931, and within a few years, her husband became one of the most dangerous men in Europe. And she cheered him on. Lena had none of the supposed political apathy many Nazi wives claimed. She pushed Reinhard to climb, demanded recognition for him, and believed in the Nazi cause fully. When Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and Reinhard became Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, Lena followed him there, proudly serving as his hostess and occasionally writing propaganda poetry. But on the 27th of May 1942, her world shattered. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague by Czechoslovak resistance fighters trained by the British. In retaliation, the Nazis destroyed entire villages, including Lidice, where women and children were slaughtered. Lena, grieving but still unapologetic, accepted one of the regime's largest state pensions. She later sued the West German government for more, claiming she was the widow of a national hero. And she won. Lena lived until 1985, remarrying briefly, but never renouncing her beliefs. In multiple interviews and writings, she defended her husband not as a reluctant official, but as a man who did what was necessary. Even decades later, Lena Heydrich was proud to have stood beside a man responsible for mass murder. Because in her eyes, it wasn't murder. It was loyalty. But while Lena fully embraced her husband's crimes, another Nazi wife tried to rebrand herself through beauty, theater, and fame. Next, Emmy Göring, Hitler's First Lady of the Reich. Section 9. Emmy Göring, the stage star who became a Nazi icon. Of all the so-called Nazi princesses, Emmy Göring stood out. While other wives wore clean aprons and clutched their children during photo ops, Emmy walked red carpets. She dined with diplomats. She wore gowns stitched in gold and velvet. And everywhere she went, she smiled, as if the war outside her window didn't exist. But Emmy wasn't just a trophy on Hermann Göring's arm. She was a carefully sculpted symbol of the Nazi regime, the First Lady of the Third Reich. And she played that role as if it were her greatest performance. The glamorous patriot. Born Emmy Sonnemann in 1893, she always had her eyes set on the stage. Her father was a chocolate factory owner, disapproving of her artistic ambitions, but her mother was more permissive. By her early 20s, Emmy had become a respected actress, performing in plays by Schiller, Goethe, and Shakespeare. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. Critics called her commanding, graceful, and regal. And in the early 1,930 seconds, When the cultural elite of Weimar Germany still mingled with rising political forces, Emmy found herself in a circle that included generals, journalists, and one man who towered over all others, Hermann Göring, diva meets dictator. Their first meeting was both volatile and dazzling. Göring, a war hero, ace pilot, and rising star in Hitler's inner circle, was blown away by Emmy's confidence. Unlike many women he'd met, she wasn't timid, quiet, or demure. She enjoyed attention, and more importantly, she knew how to hold her ground in a room full of powerful men. Where Göring was flamboyant and self-indulgent, Emmy was sophisticated and controlled. She made herself a force of presence beside him, not just a consort, but an image, Hitler noticed. And while he distrusted women close to powerful men, Emmy was different. She didn't challenge her husband's politics. She didn't seek office. She simply elevated the appearance of the Nazi regime. She and Göring married in 1935. Hitler, famously disgusted by marriage and affection, nonetheless approved. Emmy was good for the party's image, and Göring had lost his first wife, Karin, years earlier. This wasn't a scandal. It was a reinvention. Their wedding was a lavish ordeal broadcast across Germany, a spectacle of pure Aryan romance in a grand cathedral filled with uniforms and rose petals. Emmy smiled as cameras rolled. It was everything Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels could have asked for. The First Lady of the Reich. Make no mistake, Eva Braun was Hitler's emotional partner. But Emmy Göring was the regime's public queen. She hosted foreign dignitaries, posed with Hitler and Mussolini, and led charity drives for mothers and war widows. She decorated hospital wings. She recited poetry at Reich ceremonies. To the German public, she was grace, incarnate, refined, noble, and devoted. But behind the curtains was another story. Emmy claimed to be non-political, often insisting she had no interest in her husband's actions, war planning, or Nazi ideology. She said she didn't talk to him about work, didn't read newspapers, focused on arts, theater, and beauty. But the facts tell a different tale. Emmy lived in Hall, the Göring estate designed to resemble a Prussian palace. Its rooms were filled with stolen art paintings, sculptures, and antique pieces looted from Jewish families and European museums, as Göring oversaw the Nazi art-plundering apparatus. She walked past those artifacts every day. She knew where they came from. And when journalists or foreign guests arrived, it was Emmy who welcomed them. Hall wasn't just a home. It was a diplomatic stage, and Emmy played her part to perfection. Denial, dressed in silk. Despite the performance, cracks appeared. She shared Göring's lavish appetite for attention, riches, and pageantry. But as the war turned, Germany darkened. While cities were bombed and ration lines grew, the Görings continued to throw parties. Emmy's wardrobe, it was said, included over 300 high-fashion gowns. Her fur coat collection could have clothed an entire town. In public, she modeled national virtue. In private, she ignored the smoke. She and Göring had a daughter in 1938, Hedwig Göring, whom Hitler adored like a niece. The child was often photographed in military uniforms, miniaturized to match her father's. Hitler gifted her jewelry. Edda sat on SS generals' laps, and Emmy's image as the glamorous mother of the Reich solidified even further. But by 1943, the war was turning fast, and so were public opinions. As Allied bombs fell on Berlin and German soldiers froze on the Eastern Front, Emmy's silk-wrapped lifestyle became harder to defend. Collapse and reckoning. When Germany finally crumbled in 1945, Emmy's paper-thin world of theatrical denial disintegrated overnight. Göring was arrested by American forces and tried at Nuremberg as one of the primary architects of Nazi aggression. During the trials, footage of concentration camps was shown to the collaborators in court, emaciated survivors, walls of corpses, crematoriums lined with ash. Göring remained defiant. He called the court illegitimate. Emmy, watching from outside, stood by him. She insisted he had been misunderstood, a man who loved his country. Before he could be hanged, Hermann Göring took a cyanide capsule and died in his cell. The man who had gifted her stolen diamonds and paintings, who had let her climb the Nazi throne in rose-colored silk, was gone. But for Emmy, the show wasn't over yet. The trial of a star. In 1948, Emmy Göring was put on trial as a Nazi beneficiary. Though not charged with specific war crimes, she was convicted of moral complicity, a fancy way of saying, you knew. And you didn't care. She was sentenced to 1 year in prison, fined, and had 30% of her assets seized. She was also banned from the German stage for 5 years, a sentence that may have cut deeper than any prison cell. When she was released, there were no cameras, no velvet gowns, no flowers in her hands. She moved into a modest flat in Munich, penniless, disgraced, still denying responsibility. To the end of her life, Emmy insisted that she had never known what her husband had truly done, that she had only honored his position as a wife, that art, not ideology, had been her passion. But for every person who lost a loved one, for every artist whose work had been ripped from gallery walls, for every voice silenced by Nazi terror, that excuse rang hollow. Final fade. Emmy Göring died in 1973. She never regained her fame. Her daughter, Edda, later petitioned to reclaim artwork stolen by her father, claiming them as inherited property but without success. No one ever again called Emmy the First Lady of the Reich. Her legacy became a monument to the kind of privilege that flourishes in dictatorship, where glamour masks genocide and silence dresses itself in satin. Emmy's story isn't just about what she wore, it's about what she ignored. But while Emmy basked in Nazi grandeur, one woman longed for love rather than power and sacrificed everything for it. Coming next, Eva Braun, Hitler's most loyal follower and his ghost bride. Section 10. Eva Braun, the bride of the apocalypse. When it comes to the women of Nazi Germany, Eva Braun is the most misunderstood. Not a military strategist, not a propaganda mouthpiece, not officially part of the party's leadership. Publicly, she was nothing. But privately, she was Hitler's obsession, companion, and final witness. And in the final hours of the Third Reich, when the world above collapsed into fire and rubble, Eva Braun made a decision so stark, so haunting, it turned her into a ghost of history. She married Adolf Hitler, and the next morning, she took her life beside him, forever bound as the bride of a monster. The girl behind the lens. Eva was only 17 when she first met Hitler in 1929. At the time, she was working as a photography assistant for Hitler's official cameraman, Heinrich Hoffmann. Young, enthusiastic, and naive, Eva was drawn to the power and grandeur Hitler exuded, even though he was more than twice her age. But Hitler had one condition before anything could happen. She had to prove she wasn't Jewish. He assigned Martin Bormann the task of researching her ancestry. When her Aryan purity was confirmed, he proceeded with caution. Hitler hated the idea of romantic entanglements distracting from his image. He was supposed to represent something higher than intimacy, a symbol of strength, of a man married to the fatherland. So Eva was kept in the shadows. No public appearances, no official titles, no acknowledgement. She was invisible, and Hitler liked it that way. A love story built on isolation. While Hitler traveled Europe, launched invasions, and shouted speeches in front of thousands, Eva sat for days on end in his alpine compound reading, sunbathing, waiting. He forgot birthdays, canceled last-minute dinners, ignored her letters for weeks. Heartbroken and desperate, Eva attempted suicide twice. Once with a pistol, another time with sleeping pills. Hitler responded not with affection, but with guilt. After her second attempt, he increased her status in private. She received better accommodations, more privileges, and eventually, a room adjacent to Hitler's in the Berghof. But the relationship remained cruelly imbalanced. She loved him completely. He loved the idea of control, and yet she stayed. A bride on borrowed time. As World War II spiraled out of control, Eva became less patient. She wanted recognition, not just location perks or whispered affection. She wanted to be Heinz's official partner. Hitler refused. Even as his inner circle collapsed and the walls of Berlin cracked with Soviet artillery, he would not give her his name until the very end. The bunker. In April 1945, Hitler and his closest followers retreated into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Death was inevitable. Eva knew it. Everyone did. Still, she made her choice. While others fled, she came to him. New tears, new questions, new bargaining, only loyalty. On the night of April 28th, with the Red Army pushing into Berlin, Hitler finally gave Eva the one thing she had waited for her entire adult life: his last name. At 3:30 a.m., a small civil ceremony was conducted in the bunker's concrete corridors. Witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann, Eva Braun became Eva Hitler. She was overjoyed, and just hours later, she was dead. The Pact. On the morning of April 30th, Hitler and Eva had breakfast in silence. Then, they said goodbye. Records state that Eva bit into a cyanide capsule, while Hitler shot himself in the head with his personal pistol. SS officers immediately followed orders. They wrapped the bodies, carried them into the Chancellery Garden, poured gasoline over them, and set them ablaze. The remains were never officially identified. No public photos, no graves, only scorched bone fragments and ash buried deep in Soviet archives. The death of a shadow. For years, conspiracy theories swirled that Eva Braun had escaped, that Hitler never died, that the wedding and the suicide were elaborate misdirections. But history, piece by piece, told the real story. She stayed by his side. She married him in the ruins. And together, they chose death over surrender. For some, that makes her a tragic figure. For others, a fanatic. But one fact remains. She knew who he was. Everything. And she still said yes. Eva Braun never gave a single interview. Never explained, never questioned, never confessed. In the end, her story remained defined by absence, a silent woman in the background who followed evil to its most final, explosive end. But Eva wasn't the only Braun who stood beside Hitler. Her sister, Gretel, walked hand in hand with the regime and bore the weight of it long after the war. Coming up, Gretel Braun, From the Inner Circle to Silent Grief. Section 11. Gretel Braun, From the Inner Circle to Silent Grief. History often forgets Gretel Braun. She wasn't the dictator's mistress, nor the face of war propaganda. She didn't marry into party leadership by accident. She was born into the shadows of power, then forced to live with what those shadows left behind. While her sister Eva shared Hitler's final breath in the Führer bunker, Gretel Braun survived the Third Reich, but not without scars, not without silence, and not without a personal tragedy that would follow her to the grave. The other Braun sister. Gretel Braun was born in 1915 inches Munich, 4 years younger than Eva, and far less famous. Where Eva was photographed endlessly by Hitler's personal cameramen, Gretel lived mostly off-camera, often mentioned but rarely visible. But that didn't mean she wasn't connected. From the early 1930 seconds, Gretel and Eva were fixtures in Hitler's personal circle. They dined at Berghof, vacationed with SS officers, socialized alongside Nazi elites. Only a select few were permitted such intimate access, and the Braun sisters were among them. Some historians believe Gretel was one of the few people Eva confided in as her secret relationship with Hitler began. But no journals exist, no detailed memoirs, just scattered photographs, always smiling, always happy, carefully edited for the public eye. But just beneath the surface, her story was far more complicated. A marriage made for the Reich. In 1944, with Germany's war effort crumbling, Gretel married an SS cavalry commander named Hermann Fegelein. He wasn't just any officer. Fegelein was a close aide to Heinrich Himmler and had become the official SS liaison officer in Hitler's inner circle. In many ways, it was a political marriage. Fegelein had Hitler's trust, and Hitler saw Gretel as family. The wedding was lavish, the guest list filled with Nazi dignitaries, and Eva glowed with pride as her sister married into Hitler's elite ranks. But the union was shallow and short-lived. Fegelein, while charming and bold, had a well-known reputation for corruption and opportunism. He had mistresses, smuggled loot, and was ultimately more loyal to his survival than to the Reich or to Gretel. Betrayal and execution. By April 1945, as Berlin burned and Hitler isolated himself in the bunker, Fegelein attempted to flee. He disappeared from his post, allegedly stealing gold and preparing to escape the crumbling Reich with another mistress. He didn't get far. SS forces found him and dragged him back to Hitler's underground domain. Furious at what he saw as betrayal, Hitler ordered a court-martial. The charges? Treason, desertion, theft. There wouldn't be a trial, just an execution. Gretel, heavily pregnant at the time, begged Eva to intervene. She pleaded for mercy. But Eva was days away from marrying Hitler herself. And with Hitler's world disintegrating around him, even she had no power left. Fegelein was executed just hours before Eva and Hitler died by suicide. And Gretel's child was born fatherless. From inner circle to isolation. After the war, Gretel was burdened by more than memories. She was no longer the smiling guest at Reich weddings, no longer the beloved sister of the Führer's companion. She was the woman who married a traitor, the woman whose sister died for Hitler, and the woman who saw it all from the front row, publicly disgraced but not imprisoned. Gretel chose the only path available to her: obscurity. She took her child, renamed herself Gretel Braun, Lobbyauger, and disappeared from public life. No press interviews, no reappearances, no denials or memoirs. A tragedy passed down. Gretel's daughter, Eva Barbara Fegelein, named in honor of her deceased aunt, grew up in the long shadow of the Reich. In post-war Germany, the children of Nazis were often either despised, ignored, or dangerously celebrated by underground hate groups. In 1971, Eva Barbara experienced her own tragedy. She lost her boyfriend in a car accident. Unable to cope with the grief, she died by suicide just days later. Another young Braun woman consumed by hopelessness before reaching 30. Perhaps it was coincidence. Or perhaps the weight of a name can crush even the innocent. Final years and legacy. Gretel Braun died in 1987 at the age of 72. She never returned to the stage of history, never commented on her sister, never published her thoughts or memories. She lived in a quiet home in southern Germany, far from photographs, propaganda, and unwanted questions. No grave inscriptions recall her husband's execution. No plaques mention her time in Hitler's retreat. She, like many others who lived just one room away from history's nightmares, simply faded as if trying to erase her own footprints. But those footprints remain. In wedding day portraits, in bunker records, in the silent fates of her family's next generation. Final reflection. Gretel Braun's story isn't as grandiose as Eva's or as powerful as Emmy Göring's. She wasn't a face of propaganda or an open defender of Hitler, but she was there. She saw it all and said nothing. And sometimes, history isn't shaped just by those who speak. It's also shaped by those who stay quiet, while monsters speak for them.